What we can evoke through a rational analysis of art is not the experience of art itself. All we are able to offer in its place is an idea, an abstraction of what art is. Conscious human thought is a machine for generating abstractions of the world, mathematical models, symbols, categories, identities, rules of thumb, images, which we use as a map to navigate it. And though a map of Rome may be of considerable use in getting you round its streets, on its own it can never tell you what it would mean to walk those streets, or what it would feel like to actually be there. Some forms of knowledge can be communicated with relative ease from one human being to another through language, although what we can communicate is not the direct experience of things, but only description and analysis, shadows of the original. On the other hand, the knowledge of direct experience is not only limited to the individual who is experiencing, but also to the time and place of the event itself. Even the person who has actually lived the experience will not be able to truly relive the original as they revisit it in memory. In remembering a happy memory, I may find that I'm actually feeling sadness or nostalgia. The thought of things that once angered me may make me laugh now. And even recalling something as vivid as an accident, I do not again feel the physical pain that I felt in that moment. We can never truly return to what we were. In art, there is only the present tense, that moment we are all living in all the time. Not the fading past to which memories so often call us, nor that fountain of hopes and anxieties we call the future, towards which our thoughts of what we must do or hope to do inevitably lead. In the experience of art, the present is so present that it is easy to forget our own place in time. We are no longer concerned with where we are, what happened earlier that day, our immediate plans for the future. We are lost in a moment that simply is. When you see a film, your mind is not fixed on the fact that you are in a cinema. You are immersed in the experience. The cinema fades away. That is, if the film is doing its job properly. When reading a good book, you're not simply sitting in a chair staring at markings on a sheet of paper, and if you close your eyes to focus solely on listening to music, you are absorbed into the present sensation of the moment till all the world around you dissolves into nothingness. However, if you try to examine that experience in the moment, if you try to direct your attention towards your consciousness of the experience, to understand what it feels like, if you try to catch the moment and hold on to it, you're taking your attention away from the experience itself. You become self-aware, and suddenly you're no longer immersed in the moment. C.S. Lewis reflected that our dilemma is to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste. This problem has for many centuries been the main point of difference between mystics and academics. The mystics preferring the groundedness of personal experience and the truths of esoteric knowledge. The academics finding knowledge in abstraction, formalized systems, models, and the artifacts of human thought. With philosophers occupying a no-man's land in between, sometimes taking up more of the practices of one side, sometimes more of the other. Art is often a sublimation of this contradiction. Through the use of symbols, it creates its own worlds which touch us with the intensity of direct experience. If I were to ask someone to show me what the world looks like, their most likely response would be to show me a globe, or, worse still, a flat map of the world on paper. It is funny that this should be what we imagine when we think of the world, pictures and maps of the world, when the world is all around us all the time. Another answer to the same question might be to say, you're looking at it, and to point in every direction while saying, this is what the world looks like. I would like to try to talk about art in this way. There is a common assumption that it is the privileged or the elite who worry about art. The common working folk don't have time for such things. They have real-world concerns to worry about. This can fundamentally be boiled down to a common-sense philosophy of survival first and art second. In fact, this has been the stance adopted by many moral codes and philosophies throughout history that have tried to analyze in a rational way what the point of what we do is, and what we should spend our time doing. People have often found the answer to this question by fulfilling a given role within a community, by putting their life to the service of God or the service of humanity. These are the needs, aims, and desires around which both cults and cultures form, and it is not always easy to tell them apart. And they are often still the forces that drive modern political and social movements, personal and public philosophies, while we try to answer the question, well, now that I have this thing, this existence, what do I do with it? How do I go about employing my time? If I were to try and give a reason why we should bother to make art at all I could honestly say is that we do it because we want to. Sometimes we might be able to say that art is edifying, or that it teaches good moral values, but often it has little or nothing to do with such things. I don't see any reason to believe that listening to a given piece of piano music will make someone a morally better or worse person. Another justification that the rationalist camp often seeks when investigating the worth of something is asking whether it makes the world a better place. Leaving aside the significant obstacle that people have always disagreed on what will make the world a better place, or what makes a person moral, as inevitably as they disagree about what their favourite music is, what can we actually say about art making the world a better place? We can say that we like some pieces of art, though by no means all, and that they somehow improve the world through their presence. But if improving the world is our goal, one might ask, when there are people in the world who have much more serious problems to deal with, is making art really the best way to spend one's time? Almost 2.5 millennia ago, Plato's Republic saw in the arts a force that would corrupt men, stirring their more sentimental, baser emotions, that would distract them from achieving the perfect state. And this conflict between Plato and Homer can still be found today in many utopian movements whose aim is to improve the world. The effective altruists, for example, believe in applying a rigorously analytical and empirical approach, not too dissimilar from the methods of science, to the question of how they go about making the world a better place. And as might be expected, they reach two very common-sense positions. 1. We should first focus our energies on healthcare, food production, and the essentials that are materially fundamental to sustaining more and longer human lives. And 2. That dedicating one's life to art for its own sake is somewhat self-indulgent. In many ways, this is not very different from the argument made by those who ask why we bother to spend money on space exploration while there are still evils taking place here on Earth. Yet it is precisely in many tribal communities, and among those who live in much less materially rich pre-industrial societies, that the greatest importance is given to art, song, and ritual, and where objects of sublime beauty that for them require great time and effort and resources to produce are not made simply to be sold, but cherished and imbued with profoundly sacred, symbolic, and social significance. If it is true that art is simply a frilly addition to existence, a pleasant but optional extra, why is it that communities which we consider as being much poorer than ourselves often take it so much more seriously than we do? It seems that it is in rich societies such as ours where material goods have become so readily available that people have stopped looking for answers in anything other than the acquisition of wealth and stuff, and art is valued so little. This devaluing of art in the West seems to happen precisely because there is an irrational spark in us that values art so deeply. When that irrational spark tries to express the profundity of its admiration for art, it turns it into a concept. It puts art literally on pedestals and makes it into something special. But as we do this, we lose the ability to see art in a much simpler way, as a natural tendency of humans, that humans make and enjoy art with the same simple inevitability that a tree bears fruit. Instead, we are always thinking of that art which is very consciously art, and we make art while being very self-aware about the fact that we are making art. Having labelled as art those things which we value for their deep and troubling beauty, over time we start to confuse the label with art itself. Many of those of us who would wish to make something significant fool ourselves into thinking that we can do this simply by calling things we make art, or by working under the guise that we are making art, forgetting what has always been the case. It is the making that made art so great in the first place, not the labelling. In the contemporary West, there is often more art in the work of a humble artisan or craftsman than in the work of those who would see themselves as artists. In fact, so often conversations about art not only don't deal at all with art, that impulse that seeks beauty for beauty's sake, they don't even deal with art as a concept. They are simply about what we might call the art industry. We can all easily think of the exorbitant prices fetched by some works of art at auctions, at the way art is often used as a status symbol by the rich and famous, at the badly executed art of those artists who labour under the pretense that what truly counts is only the concept, or the subversion thereof, behind a work of art, not the actual, existing, physical artwork itself. An idea, incidentally, which can only be held by those to whom the materials they work with are fundamentally worthless. An individual who lives in a world where parchment is not only rare, but requires significant effort and time to produce, will take great care in what they write and how they write it. But the same will likely not hold true for a person who lives in a world in which they can cheaply buy sheets of paper by the hundred and does not value those materials which are fundamental to their work. We know that our primitive ancestors adorned their caves with paintings and incisions. They decorated their bodies with jewelry, paints, tattoos, and piercings, and we know that they produced music with the ancient flutes, bows, and rattles we have found. And these early humans were possibly the furthest thing we can imagine from privilege and riches. They were people who were barely surviving, in the majority of cases dying very young of diseases, untreated wounds, painful infections, malnourishment, living in conditions that would be shocking to virtually anybody living today, anywhere in the world. And not only did they create art, but they did so in the face of obstacles that would deter almost any contemporary artist. The amount of work that it would have taken to produce even small amounts of pigment for painting, or to carve a small bone flute, is something that is utterly alien to us, and yet in the face of such difficulty, in the face of danger and severe existential threat, these individuals who lived short, brutish, and often painful lives, people who you would think had much more pressing concerns on their mind, spent their time and resources painstakingly creating pigment one microscopic bit at a time, so as to cover entire rock faces with the most fascinating and powerful depictions, and, even more poignantly, with those life-affirming handprints that say, "I was here." A purely rational analysis of why we do things cannot account for why humans make art, just as it cannot account for why our ancestors dragged massive quantities of rock for 150 miles to build Stonehenge, when their time could have been more efficiently employed in finding and developing better resources, shelters, and so on. And yet, the really significant question is, if they had repressed their desire to erect such monuments and focused all their attention on gaining more resources and improving their material well-being, would that have made their society a better or happier one? The society we currently live in is the most efficient and the richest that has ever existed in terms of resources and material wealth. And yet, I'm not sure I would describe it as a happy society. Anxious, perhaps, would seem a more appropriate word. Every culture has had a place for dance and has defined its identity through the stories it tells and the images it creates. Men and women have accompanied their hard labour with songs, although sadly this is quite a rare sight in the modern West, and given meaning to their life story through the use of ritual. And in fact, even many of the canonic artists that we have labelled as such have often produced art while living in poverty, under the boot of oppression, or in the grips of deep psychological turmoil. Art is simply the name we give to the most excellent examples of what happens when the sensibility of the human psyche is faced with the insensibility of the universe. It's the howl of the beast that shouted "I" at the heart of the world.